Everyone thought the old rusted bus was nothing but scrap, until a homeless little girl and her dog moved in. What they created inside stunned everyone who saw it. Before we continue, leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. The film of her life opened on a road that seemed to stretch without end, a cracked ribbon of asphalt cutting through the bare fields of late autumn. A little girl, barely 10 years old, trudged along with the stubborn rhythm of someone who had been walking far too long, her sneakers worn down to thin soles. At her side padded a German shepherd, lean from hunger but dignified in every movement, ears alert to every sound around them. The sky above was a dull slate gray, heavy with the promise of rain, and the voice of the narrator lingered over the scene like a half-remembered prayer. In a world that had already broken her, a child found the only family she had left in the steady gaze of a dog, and a home in the last place anyone would ever think to look. Her name was Ruby. She had been born into a small Ohio town that had little to offer her even before tragedy struck. Her mother had passed away quietly one night, her smile fading from Ruby's world without warning. Her father, once the tall figure she clung to, had sunk under the weight of addiction until he could no longer carry her or himself. By the time he left her, on a curb in a town she did not know, she had already stopped waiting for him to come back. Months had gone by since then. Ruby did not keep count anymore. Time to her was only measured by the growl of her stomach and the ache in her legs. Avery, the dog who had appeared like a miracle on the day she thought she would not make it through the night, was the one constant. He had come from nowhere, slipping out of the shadows behind a gas station, his coat ragged and his ribs showing. When Ruby had sat down against the cold brick wall, shivering and afraid, he had walked right up to her, lowered himself onto the pavement, and laid his head in her lap. From that moment, they had been bound together. Avery was her guardian, her friend, and the only warmth she knew when the nights grew bitter. He walked slightly ahead of her now, eyes sharp, muscles tense, every few steps glancing back at her as if to check she was still there. That afternoon the wind carried the smell of damp earth and rust. Ruby's eyes scanned the field stretching out beyond the cracked road, and it was there, in the tall weeds and overgrown brush, that she saw the silhouette of something strange. Half hidden in the grass, like the skeleton of a forgotten story, was a school bus. Its paint was flaking, the yellow dulled into a dirty shade of ochre. The windows were either broken or fogged over with time, and vines crept up its side as though nature had been slowly trying to reclaim it. Ruby stopped. Avery had already noticed it. His head tilted, ears pricked. He let out a soft, low growl, not of warning but of curiosity. Ruby felt her chest tighten. She had slept under bridges, in abandoned shacks, and even one night in the stairwell of a parking garage. But this bus was different. It stood there like a relic of another life, the kind where children laughed and backpacks swung from small shoulders, where parents waved from sidewalks. She could almost hear the ghost of that laughter in the wind that slipped through the broken windows. Avery moved first. He padded into the weeds, his nose pressed low to the ground, his body alert. Ruby followed, her thin frame trembling both from exhaustion and from a strange flutter of hope she did not dare name. She pulled at the bus's heavy door until it creaked open, releasing the stale scent of rust, old leather, and dust. Avery climbed in first, stepping carefully down the narrow aisle, his paws tapping softly against the metal floor. Ruby followed, her small hands brushing against the cold, graffiti-marked seats. Inside, it was darker than she expected. Sunlight spilled in only through the cracks and shattered glass, casting long streaks of gold across the grime. Ruby walked slowly down the aisle, her breath visible in the chill air. At the back of the bus, Avery circled once before settling onto the floor, watching her with eyes that seemed to say, "It's safe here. Rest." That night, Ruby curled herself into the corner of the bus, wrapping her thin jacket tighter around her body. Avery pressed against her side, his warmth seeping into her bones. The silence of the fields wrapped around them. Ruby's eyes burned with tears she had been holding back for too long. She pressed her face into the fur of Avery's neck, sobbing quietly. Every shudder of her shoulders seemed to be absorbed by him, as though he carried the weight with her. He didn't move away. He never did. Her hand rested on his back, fingers gripping his fur as though it tethered her to the world. "Don't leave me, too," she whispered into the darkness, though her voice was so faint it was nearly swallowed by the still air. Avery shifted only enough to rest his chin over her knees, his body heavy against hers, anchoring her to the floor of that rusted bus. It was not much, but it was something. The hours slipped by slowly, Ruby drifting in and out of restless sleep. At one point, Avery's sudden movement startled her awake. His ears twitched, and he rose onto his paws, sniffing at the floorboards with intense focus. Then, without hesitation, he began to paw at one spot near the middle of the bus. His claws scraped against the wood with a sharp, urgent sound. Ruby sat up, wiping her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. She had seen Avery curious before, but this was different. There was purpose in the way he worked at the old plank. His growls low and steady, his body tense as if urging her to notice. Ruby knelt beside him, pressing her ear to the floor as if she could hear what he heard. The board rattled slightly under her touch, loose in a way that spoke of something hidden. Avery. Her voice was a tremor, a mixture of fear and wonder. She pulled at the edge of the wood with her fingers, but it would not budge. She sat back, staring at the scratched floor, at her dog, whose eyes gleamed in the dim light with something close to insistence. He pawed again, claws scraping, nose pressed hard against the board. Ruby's heart pounded. Whatever was under there, Avery had found it for a reason. She did not know yet whether it was danger or salvation. But in that moment, as the wind howled outside and the bus groaned against the weight of years, she realized that this place, the rusted, forgotten bus, was about to change everything. The morning light crept slowly across the cracked windows of the bus, spilling long beams onto the dust-coated floor. Ruby stirred awake, her small body stiff from the cold metal beneath her. Avery was already up, his nose pressed against the loose floorboard he had discovered the night before. He pawed at it again with the same urgency, then turned to her with a sharp, insistent bark, as if to say, "Don't ignore this. Look closer." Ruby rubbed her eyes and knelt beside him. The board looked ordinary, worn and cracked, but her fingertips traced along its edge and felt the faint give of something not nailed down as tightly as the rest. She bit her lip, then reached for a flat rock she had picked up during their wanderings, using it to wedge into the crack. With effort, she pried at the wood until the plank shifted with a low groan. Dust billowed up, and Avery barked again, his tail swiping the air with restless energy. Beneath the loosened board lay a small wooden box, edges rough with age, corners softened by years hidden in darkness. Ruby's hands trembled as she lifted it out, brushing off the layer of dirt that clung to its surface. Avery pressed close, sniffing, whining low in his throat as though he understood the importance of the find. Ruby swallowed hard and slowly opened the box. Inside lay a collection of items that seemed to belong to another lifetime. A few tiny toys, a chipped marble, a faded plastic doll with one arm missing, a string bracelet knotted unevenly by clumsy hands. But what caught Ruby's breath was the notebook nestled among them. Its cover was worn leather, softened by use, the corners bent, the spine cracked from being opened too many times. She opened it carefully, the pages yellowed but intact, words scrawled in uneven handwriting spilling across each sheet. Ruby read the first lines in silence, her lips moving but no sound escaping. The narrator's voice filled the silence in her mind, bringing the words to life. My name is Hannah. This bus is mine now. I don't care if it's rusty or smells like old pennies. It's the only place that feels like it's waiting for me. Someday, I'll make it more than just a hiding spot. Someday, I'll make it home. Ruby's throat tightened. She turned the page, her small fingers smudging the old ink. Hannah's words told the story of a girl who must have been close to Ruby's age, who had lived in this same bus many years ago. The entries described cold nights, hunger, the fear of being found. But between the lines of fear were flashes of stubborn hope. The girl wrote about collecting scraps of wood to patch holes in the walls, about finding comfort in the bus's broken shell. On the last page, Ruby could bear to read, Hannah had written slowly, almost carefully, "One day this bus will shine with light. It will be a real home, and maybe someone else who needs it will find it when I can't stay anymore." Ruby closed the notebook and held it to her chest, the weight of the words sinking deep. She wasn't the first child who had needed the bus. She wasn't alone in her longing for a place to belong. The echo of Hannah's promise threaded through her heart like a fragile ribbon, tying her own pain to someone who had come before. Avery nudged her arm with his wet nose, as if to bring her back to the present. She smiled faintly through the sting of tears and whispered, "We'll finish it, Avery. We'll keep the promise. We'll make this bus a home." Avery let out a short, approving bark, his ears standing tall. For the first time in weeks, Ruby felt purpose stir inside her. She set the toys and bracelet back into the box with reverence, then tucked the notebook carefully into her backpack. That afternoon, she began the smallest of changes. She gathered cardboard from the nearby roadside, flattening it into makeshift mats to cover the cold metal floor. Avery dragged in branches, dropping them proudly at her feet. Ruby laughed, an unfamiliar sound on her lips, as she arranged the branches into a crude curtain over one of the broken windows. The bus was far from a home, but every scrap they added softened the sharp edges of its emptiness. Days slipped by. Each morning, Ruby woke with a new determination. She scavenged for pieces of wood discarded near the fields, pulling nails from broken crates and tucking them into her pocket. She found a rusted tin can, which she turned into a cup. Avery stood guard when she ventured farther out, always returning to nudge her toward safety when she wandered too far. Bit by bit, the bus began to transform, not yet into a home, but into a place touched by human hands and hope. It wasn't long before someone noticed. One late afternoon, as the sun burned low and painted the fields in orange fire, Ruby heard footsteps crunching against the gravel outside the bus. Avery's head shot up, ears back, a warning growl rumbling deep in his chest. Ruby froze, clutching the notebook to her chest. The door creaked open, and an old man stepped into view. His frame was tall but bent by age, his face marked by years of sun and labor. His eyes, sharp beneath a heavy brow, scanned the bus with suspicion before landing on Ruby. His name was Elias Finch, the owner of the farmland surrounding the abandoned field. He was a man known for his stern ways and quiet isolation, and now he stood staring at the child who had turned his forgotten bus into her shelter. "What are you doing here?" His voice was rough, gravelly, carrying the weight of authority. Ruby's breath hitched. Her hands clutched Avery's fur as the dog positioned himself between her and the stranger. I didn't mean to," she stammered, her voice cracking. "We just needed somewhere to stay." Her words faltered, and tears spilled before she could stop them. I just want a place to call home." For a long moment, Finch said nothing. His gaze lingered on her trembling frame, on the dog's protective stance, on the cardboard and scraps that hinted at her desperate attempts to create order from ruin. Something in his expression shifted. The hardness in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something more complicated. Memory, perhaps, or the faint sting of empathy. Ruby lowered her eyes, waiting for him to order her out, to call someone who would take Avery away. Instead, she heard him sigh, a sound that carried the weariness of someone who had seen too much of life's cruelty. He shook his head slightly, muttering, "You shouldn't be here, girl. This ain't no place for you." But his voice lacked the bite of true anger. He looked once more at Avery, whose steady eyes met his with a quiet plea, and then at Ruby, whose small hands trembled as they gripped the notebook. Without another word, Finch turned and stepped back into the fading sunlight. The door creaked shut behind him, leaving Ruby shaken but strangely hopeful. She pressed her face against Avery's fur again, whispering through a mix of fear and relief, "Maybe he won't tell. Maybe he understands." Avery's tail thumped softly against the floor, a quiet promise that whatever came next, they would face it together. The bus creaked around them, no longer just a relic of abandonment but a vessel of secrets, of echoes from the past. Hannah's words still burned in Ruby's mind. "One day, this bus will shine with light." And now, with Avery at her side, and the memory of Finch's conflicted gaze lingering in the dusk, Ruby knew the story of the bus was not finished. It was only just beginning. The nights grew harsher as winter pressed deeper into the Ohio countryside. The old bus, with its rusting frame and thin walls, did little to keep the bitter air out. Ruby curled herself into a ball beneath the tattered blanket she had scavenged, pulling Avery close, burying her face into his thick fur. His body heat was the only real warmth she had, and even then the cold gnawed through every layer. The words in Hannah's notebook still echoed in Ruby's thoughts. "One day, this bus will shine with light." It had filled her with hope when the days were mild, but now, with the frost tightening its grip, the dream seemed impossibly far away. The floor of the bus rattled with the sound of wind threading through broken seams, and Ruby's thin body trembled with feverish shivers she couldn't control. Her forehead burned hot, and her lips cracked with dryness. She coughed until her chest ached, and Avery whined, pacing back and forth before nudging her with his nose as though to shake her awake. Ruby's voice was a whisper, ragged and weak. "I'm okay, boy. Just tired." But Avery wasn't fooled. He circled, restless, ears twitching at every sound. His instincts told him that the girl, the one he had chosen as his own, was fading. He pressed close to her, but his amber eyes darted toward the distant glow of the farmhouse lights across the snowy field. Something inside him stirred, a call stronger than habit, older than words. Hours passed in that heavy silence until finally, Ruby's body shook with another fit of coughing, her frail frame twisting under the effort. Avery barked sharply, a sound that cracked the night like thunder. He pawed at the bus door, then turned to her again. Ruby's eyes fluttered open, confused and glassy. Don't leave me," she murmured, reaching a thin hand toward him. Avery pressed his head against her palm, holding still for a moment. Then he pulled away, nose lifted, eyes fixed on the farmhouse. With a decisive growl, Avery bolted from the bus into the snow. His paws pounded against the frozen ground, his chest heaving with urgency. Snowflakes stung his eyes, but he didn't slow. He followed the line of the field until the looming silhouette of Elias Finch's farmhouse rose in the distance. He reached the gate and barked, once, twice, then again and again, each cry rising higher, sharper, filled with desperation. Inside, Elias sat in his kitchen, the lamplight pooling over the wooden table. A half-finished mug of coffee sat forgotten as he stared at the worn photograph of a young boy, his late son, tucked into a cracked frame. The boy had loved animals, especially dogs. Elias often remembered the sound of paws on hardwood, the joy in his son's laugh when their old shepherd mix would chase him around the yard. The memory still had the power to unmake him. When Avery's bark pierced through the storm, Elias's hand froze halfway to his cup. He frowned, pushing back his chair. The sound wasn't a normal bark. It wasn't the territorial snarl of a stray, or the hollow echo of a farm dog warning at the wind. This was something else, urgent, pleading. He moved to the window and peered through the frost, seeing the dog's shadow thrashing against the gate. Elias grabbed his coat, the weight of decision pulling him faster than thought. He stepped into the night, boots crunching against the snow, and moved toward the gate. Avery leapt against it, barking frantically, eyes burning with a desperation Elias hadn't seen in years. All right, boy," Elias muttered, his voice softer than he expected. "Show me what you need." The moment he unlatched the gate, Avery bounded back toward the field, then paused to make sure Elias followed. The old man hesitated only a breath before trudging after him, his lantern swaying in the wind. Avery barked again and took off, always pausing just far enough ahead to make sure Elias kept up. The bus loomed out of the darkness, its broken windows glowing faintly from the weak light of the lantern. Elias stepped inside, and his heart clenched. Ruby lay crumpled on the makeshift bedding, her face flushed, her body trembling with fever. Avery stood over her, eyes locked on Elias as if demanding, "Do something." Now Elias knelt beside her, his old hands trembling as he pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. "Good Lord," he whispered, "you're burning up." Ruby stirred faintly at his touch, her cracked lips forming words. Don't let them take Avery." Her small voice, laced with fear even in weakness, pierced through Elias's chest. He looked at the dog, now curled protectively around her, and felt something break loose inside him. The hardened shell he had carried for so long, built from years of loss and solitude, cracked open. He saw not just a child and a stray dog, but a bond deeper than blood, a loyalty that demanded respect. Elias didn't hesitate. He gathered Ruby into his arms, her frail weight startling in its lightness. She moaned softly, clutching the edge of his coat even in her fevered haze. Avery pressed close, following every step as Elias carried her out into the storm. Back at the farmhouse, Elias laid Ruby in the guest room, his son's old room, untouched for years. The faded wallpaper, the toys still stacked on shelves, the bed neatly made but never slept in since. Elias's throat tightened as he covered her with thick blankets, then stoked the fire until the room glowed with heat. Avery leapt onto the rug near the bed, curling so close his fur brushed against Ruby's hand. As the hours crawled past, Elias sat vigil by the bedside, spooning sips of warm broth between Ruby's lips whenever she stirred. The fever broke slowly, sweat beading on her forehead before giving way to calmer breathing. Each time she moved, her hand brushed against Avery's coat, as if drawing life from his presence. Elias watched the silent, exchange, and whispered to himself, Maybe you two need this place more than I do. By morning, the storm had eased, and the world outside was wrapped in a quiet blanket of snow. Ruby's fever had lessened, her breathing steadier. She opened her eyes to find Elias sitting in the chair beside her bed, his face lined with fatigue. Avery's head rested on the edge of the mattress, eyes half closed but vigilant. You're safe now, Elias said softly when Ruby's gaze met his. She swallowed hard, her voice weak. Please don't make them take him. He's all I have. Elias reached out, smoothing back a strand of her tangled hair. His voice cracked as he murmured, I won't let anyone take him, child. He belongs with you. For the first time in years, the old man felt a flicker of purpose, a reason to open the doors of his heart again. He looked from Ruby to Avery, the two lives bound together by survival and love, and knew what had to come next. The bus was not just a relic of rust and ruin, it was a promise waiting to be kept. And maybe, just maybe, he would be the one to help them keep it. The storm passed, leaving Havenwood's outskirts hushed under a sheet of glittering snow. The old bus stood silent in the field, its rusted sides catching the pale sunlight, still looking like nothing more than a forgotten husk. But for Ruby, wrapped in Elias Finch's old wool coat, the sight of it was no longer a symbol of abandonment. It was a challenge, a canvas waiting to be reborn. She had spent 2 nights under Elias's roof, her fever easing, her strength slowly returning. Avery rarely left her side, keeping his nose tucked against her arm as if tethering her to life. And Elias, though still gruff and measured, found himself watching over the girl and her dog with something resembling protectiveness. Each time he caught himself softening, he would mutter excuses. She needed food, warmth, safety. And yet the excuses never masked the truth. His house, long silent, felt alive again. That morning, Ruby insisted on walking back to the bus. It's ours, she told Elias with a steadiness that surprised him. That's where Avery and I belong. I want to make it what it was meant to be. Her voice cracked, but the determination in it reminded Elias of his son, once stubborn about building treehouses and fixing broken bikes. Elias sighed, but pulled his heavy gloves tighter. Then we'll do it right. If you're going to live in that heap, it's not staying a heap. We'll turn it into something worth calling home. Ruby blinked up at him, the corners of her lips curving into the faintest smile. Avery barked once as if sealing the agreement. The work began slowly, haltingly. Elias dragged his tools from the barn, hammer, nails, an old saw dulled by years of disuse. He brought a few planks of pine from the lumber shed, their scent sharp in the cold air. Ruby crouched beside him, her small hands eager to help, though she fumbled with the tools. Elias guided her carefully, showing her how to grip a hammer without pinching her fingers, how to line up a nail before striking. At first she missed, bending the nail sideways, but each time she straightened her shoulders and tried again. By afternoon, the sound of hammering echoed across the field. Avery patrolled the perimeter like a watchful foreman, occasionally trotting up to drop some random scrap, a stick, a rag, once even a half-rotted glove, as if offering contributions of his own. Ruby laughed for the first time in weeks when Elias solemnly accepted one of Avery's gifts and tucked it into the tool bucket. It's teamwork, Elias muttered, though his eyes gleamed with quiet amusement. The project drew curious eyes. A passing farmhand from town slowed his truck to watch, eyebrows raised at the sight of the old man, the girl, and the dog working in the snow. Word spread quickly, as it always did in small towns. By the next day, a pair of teenagers showed up, lugging cans of leftover paint. "Heard you're fixing up that bus," one of them said awkwardly, shoving the supplies forward. Figured it could use some color. Elias narrowed his eyes, but let them stay. Soon after, Mrs. Whitaker, who ran the thrift store in town, trudged across the field with a bundle of quilts in her arms. "These aren't selling anyway," she huffed. "Better off keeping someone warm." She pressed them into Ruby's hands, her expression softening at the girl's whispered thanks. What began as a private effort slowly grew into something larger. The bus became a magnet, pulling in bits of kindness from every corner of Havenwood. A carpenter came by to patch holes in the flooring, his practiced movements quick and sure. A pair of young mothers painted the interior walls a gentle cream, while Ruby dipped a brush herself, streaking the metal with uneven strokes that somehow made it feel more alive. Avery padded through wet paint twice, leaving paw prints that dried into permanent marks on the floor, his signature claim on the home. Through it all, Elias remained steady at Ruby's side, guiding her hands, steadying her steps, though his own chest ached each time he looked at her thin frame. She reminded him not just of his son, but of every fragile thing he had once been too proud to protect. One evening, as the winter sun sank behind the trees, the bus glowed with new life. Lanterns hung from the ceiling, their warm light dancing across freshly scrubbed walls. Ruby had arranged the quilts into a makeshift bed and tucked the old toy horse from the hidden box onto the shelf Elias had built for her. She stood in the center, gazing around with wide eyes, her hand pressed against her chest. "It feels different," she whispered. Elias nodded. "Because it's yours now. Every nail, every board, you put it there." Ruby shook her head. "We all did. Me, Avery, you, and them." She gestured to the townsfolk who lingered outside, their faces lit with quiet pride as they admired the transformation. That night, Elias suggested adding something else, a wall, not for insulation, but for remembrance. "A place for the things that came before," he explained. Together, he and Ruby cleared a small section at the back of the bus. She carefully pinned the pages of the old notebook there, smoothing them flat with gentle hands. Around it, she placed the trinkets from the wooden box, each item becoming both decoration and memory. She called it the Wall of Dreams. The community understood. Neighbors began bringing small offerings, a carved figurine, a faded photo, a child's drawing, each item carrying a story of hope or loss. Soon the wall was filled with color and history, not just Ruby's but everyone's. It became something larger than a memorial. It was a mosaic of the town's shared resilience. That night, as Ruby sat cross-legged on her bed, Avery's head in her lap, Elias lingered outside the bus. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he studied the warm glow spilling from its windows. He could hear faint laughter drifting out, the kind of laughter he hadn't thought possible again. His throat tightened as he whispered to the night, "This bus isn't just a shelter anymore. It's sacred." But even as joy filled the cold evenings, Elias carried a quiet weight. He knew the authorities could step in at any moment. A child alone, a makeshift home, it wasn't legal. He'd wrestled with the phone on his kitchen wall more than once, his fingers hovering over the numbers. Each time he stopped, haunted by the memory of Avery's desperate cry in the snow. The bond he'd seen between the girl and her dog wasn't something to sever. It was something to protect. And so he kept building, kept guiding, kept guarding this fragile, luminous spark that had risen out of rust and ruin. For Ruby, every brushstroke, every nail hammered was a promise kept. Not just Hannah's promise written years ago in the notebook, but her own. She would not be forgotten. She would not drift through the world invisible. She had Avery, she had Elias, and now she had a place that was truly hers. The bus of rust had become the bus of light, And with it, Ruby's world, once fractured beyond repair, was beginning to piece itself back together. Spring crept quietly into Havenwood. The snow melted away, leaving behind damp earth that smelled of renewal. The fields around the bus, once barren and gray, now shimmered with the faint green of new grass. Birds returned, perching on the twisted branches near the old husk of metal that was no longer just a bus, no longer just a forgotten relic. It had become something more, a beacon. Inside, Ruby stirred awake to the sound of Avery's tail thumping against the floorboards. The morning light streamed through the small curtains she and Elias had stitched from scraps of fabric townsfolk had brought. It filtered golden across the wall of dreams, where the notebook pages, drawings, and trinkets from so many lives now hung. Each item told a story, and together they made the bus feel alive, as if the walls themselves carried the heartbeat of hope. Ruby sat up, pulling the quilt Mrs. Whitaker had given her close. For the first time in her young life, she wasn't waking in fear of where she would sleep next or whether someone would find her and take Avery away. She was waking in her home, a real home. The celebration had been Elias's idea. He'd muttered about it for days before finally admitting the truth. If you're going to build something like this, folks ought to see what it means, not just for you, but for all of us. And so the townsfolk came. On the first warm Saturday of April, cars and trucks pulled up along the field, their doors opening to laughter, chatter, and the aroma of food carried in covered dishes. Elias had set up an old wooden table outside the bus, covering it with a patchwork cloth Ruby had chosen. The table groaned under the weight of casseroles, pies, jars of sweet tea, and loaves of bread. It wasn't just a meal. It was a communion of sorts, a town rediscovering its heart. Ruby greeted them shyly at the doorway of her bus. She wore a simple dress someone from town had left for her, its hem brushing against her knees. Avery stood tall beside her, chest puffed out, as if he knew today wasn't just about a bus, but about what he had saved. When folks stepped inside, their eyes widened. The quilts, the shelves Elias built, the warm lantern light. It wasn't extravagant, but it was beautiful. "Feels like stepping into another world," one woman whispered, tracing her hand along the painted wall. Others nodded, many blinking back tears. Ruby beamed, a smile that seemed to light up every corner. "Welcome to my home," she said softly, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. "Thank you for helping me build it." Later, as the sun dipped lower, Elias called for everyone's attention. He stood beside Ruby and Avery, his weathered hands resting on the back of a chair. "Most of you know how this started," he said, his voice gravelly. "A little girl, no family to claim her, and a dog who wouldn't give up. I won't lie, I thought it was foolish. Thought a bus was no place for a child, but then I saw something. I saw this girl fight to keep hope alive, even when the world gave her every reason not to, and I saw a dog who would rather freeze than leave her side." His eyes softened as he looked at Ruby. "This bus isn't just her home. It's ours too, a reminder that what we build together matters more than what we've lost." There was silence, broken only by Avery's soft bark, as if punctuating Elias's words. Then the applause came, hesitant at first, then swelling until it echoed across the field. Ruby flushed red, ducking her head into Avery's fur, but her smile remained. That evening, Ruby insisted on hosting the very first meal inside the bus. Of course, the crowd couldn't all fit, but she invited the youngest children and their parents to sit on her quilts and cushions while she poured lemonade into mismatched cups. She carried a plate of bread with both hands, serving it carefully, her face glowing with pride. For the first time, she wasn't just a girl surviving. She was a girl giving. After the meal, she stood before the wall of dreams. The room fell quiet as she placed her hand gently on the notebook page that had started it all. She wrote that one day this bus would be full of light, Ruby said, her voice wavering but clear, and now it is. Not just because of me, but because of all of you. I finally have a home. The crowd erupted into applause again, but Ruby hardly heard it. Avery pressed against her leg, his amber eyes lifted toward her with the same silent promise he'd carried since the day they'd met. You're not alone. Not anymore. As the night wound down, lanterns inside the bus glowed like small suns. Outside, townsfolk lingered, reluctant to leave the warmth of something rare. A community bound by kindness, by loyalty, by love that asked for nothing in return. Elias remained on the steps of the bus, watching Ruby curl up beside Avery. She whispered to him, words Elias couldn't hear, but he saw Avery's tail thump gently in reply. The old man rubbed at his eyes, clearing the sting. His home had been silent for too long, haunted by memories he hadn't been ready to face. But now, somehow, the laughter of a child and the loyalty of a dog had filled the silence. He spoke softly, almost to himself. That bus ain't just reclaimed, so am I. The camera pulled back, the bus now a glowing lantern in the middle of a wide, dark field. The rust was still there, the dents still visible, but they no longer told a story of decay. They told a story of survival, of transformation. Avery lifted his head from the threshold, ears pricked, eyes steady, like a guardian keeping watch over the home he had fought for. Ruby's laughter drifted through the open window, carried into the night air. And then, the narrator's voice returned, low and steady, wrapping around the closing image. Sometimes a home isn't made of walls or bricks. Sometimes it's built of loyalty, of love, and of the courage to believe in tomorrow. A little girl and her dog turned a forgotten bus into a sanctuary of light, and in doing so they reminded an entire town that hope, once kindled, can never be silenced. The screen faded to black, leaving only the soft echo of a child's laughter and the steady thump of a dog's tail against a wooden floor.